All right, today we're going to talk about this period in American history from the late 1960s throughout the 1970s where Americans are going to go through a tremendous change in attitude. As we've been talking about, the United States since World War II has been this superpower. Early on was the only one possessing the nuclear weapon. The economy going through the roof. More and more Americans are able to afford automobiles, luxury goods. They're able to purchase homes for the first time. The economy is completely recovered from where it had been in the Great Depression. And while there had been setbacks against the Soviet Union in communism in the world, the United States had continued to contain communism in most parts of the world. Not only that, the United States is looking optimistic in the mid 1960s. A lot of people are looking at the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and they're thinking, all right, this isn't going to immediately solve racial problems, but at least we're on an upward trend. So Americans are, in general, happy. The economy's doing well. It seems like politics are divisive, but it seems like they're pushing towards solving the problems of the United States. This great society that Johnson has implemented, maybe this will bring Americans, provide better equal opportunity, and perhaps the United States is only going to continue to get better. Well, what we're going to see in the late 1960s into the 1970s is this optimism that had been building post World War II is going to go away. And we're going to enter this period where we're going to see a lot of Americans become disillusioned with their government. Americans are going to become depressed. Americans are going to become more consumer natured instead of social in nature. They're going to be less patriotic. And we're going to see this economy fall away towards depression. We're going to see people start questioning government decisions instead of supporting government decisions. We're going to see these progressive racial politics fall away towards race riots. We're going to see a rise in gang and drug use. We're going to see an increase in serial killers. We're going to talk about gangs like the Hell's Angels emerging. Guys like this, serial killers dressing like clowns. What's going to happen in the late 1960s and 1970s is the U.S. is going to become insane, and this is going to culminate in things like disco becoming popular. So what we're going to talk about is this very big departure from what had been happening in prior decades in the U.S. So first, we're going to discuss this growing disillusionment that Americans will start feeling towards their government. Again, it's not like Americans have ever trusted their government. Americans always had this healthy questioning of their government. You always, not always obviously, but you're going to disagree with your politicians. You generally don't, worship your politicians like you'll see it sometimes in other countries. Americans, we don't hero worship our politicians, but we also, prior to this time period, you understand that they're doing their jobs, and you don't really look much beyond that. And Americans, again, not always agreeing with their politicians, had trusted them. Well, we're going to see that in the late 1960s and 1970s, a lot of this trust is going to erode, and we're going to see people not just question their politicians, but start to assume their politicians are corrupt, assume their politicians are out exclusively to better themselves and don't have the interests of the American people in mind. And we're going to see, in particular, this new generation of people, a lot of young kids that have grown up in this post-World War II time, these baby boomers, as you'll sometimes hear them called, in particular, start to question authority figures, their parents and the government, and start to basically rebel in a variety of different ways. So what happens? What happens to turn this healthy distrust of the U.S. government and this healthy questioning of the government into outright the government is out to trick me? What happens here in the 1960s and 1970s to foster this attitude? Well, some of this is going to emerge as a result of policies that Lyndon Johnson will have in regards to this country, Vietnam, or these two countries of Vietnam in the 1960s during his presidency. So last time we talked about Vietnam, we'd seen this area, Indochina, being divided into four countries. So as we mentioned before, Indochina had previously been a colony of France. France had ruled here. France had done what it had done with its colonies in Africa and other colonies in Asia, and it had basically taken over Vietnam using boots on the ground military force, political influence, and it had extracted the resources and labors of the people of Indochina for the benefit of the home country of France. Well, we saw the Germans had taken over France during World War II, and Japan had then stepped in and taken over Indochina in France's absence. Again, France, after World War II, tried to retake Indochina, and it gets the support of the United States in doing this. And France is not ultimately going to be successful in retaking Indochina because this Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh will lead an uprising against the French. And what's going to happen in 1954 at this Geneva Convention is basically there will be an agreement where France will leave Vietnam, or I'm sorry, leave Indochina, no longer occupy Indochina, but the government of Indochina will be divided into four separate nations. Again, we're not going to talk about Laos or Cambodia, but what happens with Vietnam is it's going to be divided into two sections. North Vietnam will be placed under the government of Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh is communist. He's basically believes in more of the Soviet style of communal society, government ownership, major industries, that type of thing. And South Vietnam, as part of France's agreement to leave, will be placed under a capitalist government. We're going to talk more about this in just a second, but the idea is going to be that this will be a temporary arrangement. And what's going to happen with Vietnam, first is initially set for 1956, is there's going to be a vote for the people of North Vietnam and South Vietnam to eventually unify, and they're going to unify under a single government. So they're divided in 1954, and the idea is in a couple years' time, 2 years, there's going to be a vote. The South Vietnamese people will vote, do we become a part of a unified communist Vietnam, or do we become part of a unified capitalist Vietnam? North Vietnamese are going to do the same thing. Well, when this arrangement is set up in 54, the Western powers, including France, Britain, and the United States, are going to think that, well, of course the Vietnamese are going to vote to be a capitalist government, because what we're going to see by 56 is South Vietnam will be flourishing, its economy is going to be growing because we're going to be supporting it, capitalist government's better, and North Vietnam, because communism is an inferior economic system, the people there won't be doing as well. And so what's going to happen is the people of South Vietnam, I like the way things are going, let's stick with this. People of North Vietnam, look what they have down there, let's vote for this to happen. So 1954, this situation set up. Well, unfortunately for the Western powers, South Vietnam's not going to shape out like they expected. And part of this is because it's going to be placed under the leadership of this guy here, Ngo Diem, okay, President Diem. So when the Western powers, when France leaves, South Vietnam's placed under a pro-Western, pro-capitalist President Diem. President Diem will take power, and he's going to have the support of these Western countries. He's going to run this in a capitalist, as a capitalist country. Well, what's going to happen is that President Diem, there's not really any two ways around it, is not going to do a very good job as president. Okay, he's going to make a number of enemies, and we're not going to see the economic growth that the Western powers were hoping in South Vietnam, and he's going to earn a lot of enemies very quickly. Now, why does this happen? Well, part of it's going to owe to Diem's upbringing. So Diem had grown up in colonial French Vietnam. He'd actually gone to a Catholic school. The French are Catholic, been raised as a Catholic, could speak multiple languages, including French. And he's very, again, pro-Western, because he'd been raised in this pro-Western colonized country. And when he becomes president, he's going to be maintaining a lot of the attitudes he'd learned as a child. In particular, he's going to be very devoutly Catholic, or at least, he supports the Catholic Church. And again, this is okay because a lot of people in Vietnam had become Catholic while it was a French colony. But the thing is, Diem is going to be uber Catholic. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but he's going to make sure that when he takes over the government in 54, that the people in power are also Catholic. So the people in his administration, they're going to be Catholic. The people that are in local positions of power, he wants to ensure they're Catholic. And again, this will be fine to a percentage of Vietnam's population because there's a percentage that's Catholic, but there's a lot of Vietnam's population that are other religions, including things like Buddhists, okay? Well, these Buddhists are going to see that essentially their government's being taken over by this Catholic nation, and they're going to feel persecuted. They're going to feel that they don't have any place in their government because of the bias in Diem's government. And it will be a definitive bias. If you're in the military and you're Buddhist, you're probably going to be denied a promotion, and a Catholic will get the promotion over you. It's a definitive bias, okay? Well, as a means of protest, we'll see a number of Buddhists come here, get out in the streets and publicly call for, a revision or review of the government and, its anti-Buddhist, anti-non-Catholic religious policies. Again, Diem's going to ignore these policies, and you'll see as a means of protest, some Buddhists will actually begin self-immolating themselves. So what that means is they'll light themselves on fire. We actually see a number of Buddhists pour gasoline all over themselves, light themselves on fire over what they see as this persecution of Buddhists and this denial of government position to Buddhists in Vietnam. This is probably pretty famous photograph seen everywhere. Rage Against the Machine. This is a cover of one of their albums. So this actually happened throughout Vietnam. Now, if Diem were a good politician, he'd at least make some overtures towards the Buddhists, and he would maybe promote some Buddhists to prominent positions of power, do something to appease this faction of the Vietnamese population. But instead, he's not going to do anything. And as a matter of fact, the woman that is essentially not his married wife, it's a de facto first lady because it's his mistress, but she's always around him, which again is not very Catholic of him, but she'll actually make fun of these Buddhists, start laughing about how it was interesting that there was a barbecue on the street, things like that. So again, he's not earning favors among non-Catholics in Vietnam. We'll also see President Diem become unpopular in South Vietnam simply because of his pro-Western philosophy. So a lot of people were happy, or the majority of Vietnamese were happy when the French left. Again, as a colonized nation, they didn't like their labor and resources going back to France. Well, when Indochina is divided up into these 4 countries, South Vietnamese are going to say, a lot of people in South Vietnam will say, what the president's doing here is basically continuing colonization. We're still seeing, trade agreements with Western nations and France that are unfair to the South Vietnamese. They'll see him buddying up to the Western powers. And again, part of this is because the Western powers are supporting his government. And some people look at this as basically neo-colonialism. This guy's a puppet of these Western powers, which a lot of people will disagree with, again, because of this history of colonialism in Vietnam. So a lot of people against him because of that. Some people think he is, and this owes to his close relationships with the Western powers, he's too harshly anti-communist. Anybody that is left-leaning in their politics, Diem is going to exclude from politics. And again, part of this is due to influence from the French, in particular the British and the Americans, who say we don't want any communist influence here. And some people think he's taking this to the extreme, and some people think that maybe Vietnam could benefit from South Vietnam could benefit from some socialist policies, but Diem is very resistant to that, in part because of the influence of the West. And you add on to that Diem's simply a poor leader. So the United States likes Diem because he's pro-Western, he's anti-communist, but even the United States' own advisors and diplomats in South Vietnam are going to be reporting back that this guy is remote, authoritarian, and inflexible, meaning that he's not willing to adapt to the situation, he's harsh against criticism, and he's just in general a bad leader. So you've got this uber-Catholic bad leader, this guy who is a lot of people view as essentially giving up to the West, and this is going to make a lot of South Vietnamese unhappy. Well, because of this, when the vote is set to come up in '56, the Americans, the French, the South Vietnamese realize that so many people are unhappy with Diem that if the vote's taken, there's a very good chance that the South Vietnamese would vote to unify under Ho Chi Minh's government in North Vietnam. So instead of having this unifying vote, they're simply going to postpone it. They'll say, we'll have the vote later. All right? Again, South Vietnamese government, the pro-Western South Vietnamese government, capitalist government, doesn't want to lose the election and have Vietnam unified under a communist government, so they postpone the election. Well, what this is going to get is a lot of people in South Vietnam are going to start determining that if this guy won't legally allow us to become communist and join with North Vietnam, then maybe we will overthrow the Diem government and we'll unify with North Vietnam through a revolutionary movement. And you're going to see in South Vietnam the rise of a insurgent group known as the Viet Cong. Now, this Viet Cong isn't going to be an official army. They're not going to have uniforms, anything like that. It's just going to be pro-communist South Vietnamese that want to take over South Vietnam, unify it with the North, and place this unified North Vietnam under a communist government. So South Vietnamese, upset with Diem's government, don't see a legal way to become communist, so they're going to start this insurgency, and what they'll do is they'll attack South Vietnamese army targets in the countryside. They'll start taking over villages in the countryside, and they'll start these anti-government movements in South Vietnam. Not only that, as the vote continues to be postponed through the 1950s, you'll actually see Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam start supporting the Viet Cong. They'll start sending supplies down to the Viet Cong. They'll start providing information to the Viet Cong to support this movement against the South Vietnamese government, again, because North Vietnam wants South Vietnam to be unified under their government. And eventually, and we'll talk about this more shortly, North Vietnam will even start sending soldiers down to South Vietnam to support the Viet Cong efforts and to destabilize the South Vietnamese government. Okay? So think about it this. South Vietnam is now facing an insurgency, and it's essentially facing an invasion from North Vietnam in an attempt to turn its government communist. All right, so what are you supposed to do about this if you're the United States? Well, the U.S., since China had fallen to communism, and even before that in Europe, the U.S. had feared that if communism starts spreading, that the original communist nations are going to be able to fulfill their promises to their people, and then they're going to get new markets, and then they're going to want to spread communism. More communism means better life for communist countries, more allies, that type of thing. Basically, they think if one country becomes communist, it's more likely that they're going to spread communism to the next countries. And then if that country becomes communist, they're going to spread to the next country. And the U.S. has bought into this policy of this domino theory. If one domino falls, then the next domino is going to fall. And they'd almost seen that. Again, China had fallen to communism, and it had had almost China and North Korea. It had almost tipped South Korea over to communism. Again, it took a lot of effort from the UN to prevent that from happening, but it could possibly spread throughout Asia if it's allowed to spread beyond North Vietnam. So if you lose South Vietnam to communism, then Cambodia is going to come next, then Laos is going to come next, then maybe South Korea is gone, and then Thailand, wherever. So you've got to stop it. You've got to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism, whether it be through legal measures to vote, Viet Cong insurgency, or North Vietnamese invasion. So what do you do about this? Well, the initial issue is going to come up during Dwight D. Eisenhower. His solution is going to just be provide Diem with a military intelligence, maybe put some naval ships up here to watch for North Vietnam's actions, provide military advisors to South Vietnam, advise them, okay, this is how you rout out insurgents, this is how you deal with North Vietnamese invasions, and just give them military support, almost like the Truman Doctrine. You provide arms to countries threatened by taking over with communism. I mean, it does fit under the Truman Doctrine. Military advisors, spies, military aid. Well, so Eisenhower starts doing this with South Vietnam. And by the way, the Soviet Union will start doing this with North Vietnam. So we'll give you arms, we'll give you Soviet military advisors, because we want you to encourage you to spread. Now, should point out Eisenhower isn't willing, and we're going to talk about this more in a second, isn't willing to launch the U.S. and attack North Vietnam because he doesn't want to escalate things with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is not going to outright, attack South Vietnam to make it communist. Again, they don't want to escalate things. But you see this, both sides start supporting their guys. Proxy war, essentially. So this begins under Eisenhower, and it's going to continue under Kennedy. Kennedy will start doing the same thing. He starts sending additional military advisors over. Eventually, it's going to go from 500 military advisors in South Vietnam, U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam under Eisenhower, to 16,000 under Kennedy. Now, these guys are getting over here. All they're doing is training South Vietnamese troops, Diem soldiers. This is how you root out insurgents, that type of thing. Okay, so also Kennedy will send money, and a lot of Kennedy's money is going to be going to supporting building schools, infrastructure, hopefully deter people from joining the Viet Cong or supporting North Vietnam by making the economy in South Vietnam better. All right, well, Kennedy's sending these troops over. I shouldn't say troops, military advisors. He's telling them, we're not fighting ourselves, we're just training the South Vietnamese. But the numbers are increasing, and Kennedy's pumping up more money and more money to South Vietnam. Well, by the end of 1963, as Kennedy is doing this, you're actually going to see an overthrow of Diem's government. People just in South Vietnam get tired of his authoritarian regime, tired of his pro-Catholicism, overthrow him. And it's right around the same time that Kennedy's assassinated and Lyndon Johnson takes over. So Lyndon Johnson is going to inherit this sticky situation in South Vietnam from Kennedy. So we've just had the Diem government overthrown. We just, Kennedy's been putting military advisors in there. What are you going to do, Lyndon Johnson? So some people, and this is actually something that Kennedy considered shortly before his assassination, some people are going to recommend the U.S. just pull its advisors out of here. Some people have been saying to Kennedy, take those 16,000 troops, or advisors we have there, and get them out of here. Just stop with the aid to South Vietnam, because we were barely holding on to South Vietnam with Diem in charge. Now that he's overthrown, and what's going to happen to South Vietnam for the next couple years is essentially going to be one guy taking power, another guy taking power, and it's going to be sort of chaotic. But basically, Kennedy's advisors were saying South Vietnam is just going to fall to communist forces, whether it be the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese simply invading South Vietnam. It's going to happen. Let's just cut our losses and leave. And they're going to, Kennedy's advisors, the people advising Kennedy to do this, will make that same recommendation to Johnson. Let's just get the F out of here. We're not going to be successful. This is going to fall anyway. And a lot of people, well, historians say that's exactly what Johnson should have done. He should have just cut his losses, got out of Vietnam, and let it fall to the communists. Anyone who says that doesn't understand what Johnson's trying to do in 1963, 64, 65. Johnson can't remove troops at that time because think what he's trying to do in the United States. He's passing civil rights legislation. Civil Rights Act 1964, Voting Rights Act 1965. He's trying to formulate this great society. He's trying to invest in these programs that will provide equal opportunity to lower classes and, give better opportunity to Americans in general. And he's facing a lot of criticism for this because a lot of these measures will be perceived as sort of tiptoeing on socialism or maybe communism. It's the government trying to provide equality to the people. And a lot of people criticize Johnson as being, they don't think he's a communist, but they think he's almost got communist sympathies, or he's tiptoeing on the line towards socialism or even communism. So if Johnson had decided the second that he gets out of here, I'm pulling these advisors out of South Vietnam, I'm going to let it be taken over by the communists, people will point at that, and then they'll point to his Civil Rights Act, and they'll say, hey, this guy's a communist sympathizer. Look what he did over there. So Johnson has to maintain a hard-line, anti-communist, international policy in order to sort of get the American public to go along with his domestic reforms. He can't have left-leaning domestic reforms and also have left-leaning international policies. People will look at that and say, get this commie out of here. So Johnson has to take a hardline stance, can't just leave. Well, he actually wants to take a more aggressive stance than Kennedy because, again, if South Vietnam falls, he's going to be labeled as a commie or not hard enough on communism at the very least. So what Johnson's going to do is he's actually going to look to increase the United States military presence in Vietnam to show that he's hard on communism internationally. And he's actually going to have the opportunity to do this shortly before the 1964 presidential election. So what's going to happen on August 2nd, 1964 is there's going to be an incident in this Gulf of Tonkin, okay? What this instance will be is that a United States destroyer is going to become engaged in even a firefight. It's not necessarily what it should be called, but what we have is basically a he said, she said version of events, okay? So what we've been able to recount is that this U.S. destroyer is out here off the coast of North Vietnam providing intelligence for the South Vietnamese government and basically monitoring what North Vietnam's doing. The United States, again, distrustful of the North Vietnamese government, don't like communist government over here. So they've got this destroyer out here, chilling out here, watching for whatever North Vietnam does. So it's just here spying. There's probably a lot of radio, picking up radio, that type of thing, making sure the North Vietnamese they're not preparing for an invasion of South Vietnam or anything. And so this U.S. destroyer's out here chilling out, and then it gets, what we think is that it gets within 12 miles of North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese coast. Well, North Vietnam and the United States have different definitions of where a country's sovereign territory begins. So what we think is that the U.S. destroyer is using the U.S. definition of open seas, but the North Vietnamese think that the U.S. destroyer is entering their waters that constitute part of their nation, and so they're going to send out 3 gunboats to scare off the U.S. ship. Somebody's going to fire first. We don't know who fired first. Probably, potentially the Vietnamese gunboats, because again, they think this U.S. boat's in their territory. But whatever happens, shots will be fired between North Vietnamese boats and U.S. boats. and this U.S. destroyer is going to end up sinking three South Vietnamese, or I'm sorry, North Vietnamese gunboats. Okay, so it's an attack. It's probably a sort of a mistaken thing. It's not something that was, a precursor to an invasion. It was some confusion over borders. Again, that's what we think happened. There's some dispute over exactly what happened in this first Gulf of Tonkin incident. Well, there's going to be a second Gulf of Tonkin incident 2 days later. Okay, so here's the thing. 2 days later, there's a U.S. Navy is going to detect that North Vietnamese gunboats had approached a different U.S. destroyer, and the U.S. destroyer's radars will pick up that these North Vietnamese gunboats had approached the destroyer and fired on it. Okay? Well, the destroyer will then, not seeing the boats, North Vietnamese boats, again, these radars the U.S. has, the detection systems are really advanced, will then fire on these North Vietnamese boats they think are attacking them and firing on them. And what the U.S. Destroyer will think it does is it thinks it's going to hit and sink these North Vietnamese boats. So this whole fight essentially takes place on this piece of radar equipment. But it looks like we just had this incident where North Vietnam fired on American ships 2 days before, and they followed it up with a second attack on American ships. Now, the first incident happened, okay? Again, there's some dispute over the order of events, U.S. entering the water, North Vietnam thinks they're attacking or whatever, they fire on them. But that one actually happened. North Vietnamese did fire on the Americans. Again, they may have even been justified in doing so because they thought the Americans were entering their sovereign waters. But the thing is, with this second Gulf of Tonkin incident, 2 days after the first one, there's no evidence that anything actually happened here. So the August 2nd one happened. The August 4th one, everything happens on a radar. But what the destroyer is going to then report to his commander, who will then eventually report to Johnson, is that the North Vietnamese have attacked us yet again. What we think probably happened is that the destroyer's radar had a glitch or something. What it had picked up was maybe a fishing boat, or it picked up nothing. But that's not what's going to be reported up to Johnson. What's going to be reported to Johnson is that we've had these two incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin. We've been fired upon. So Johnson is going to decide to take this Gulf of Tonkin incident as an excuse to increase American military presence in Vietnam. So he's going to go to Congress, and he's going to ask for permission to use his executive power, not declaring war or anything, but he's just going to ask Congress, can I send U.S. soldiers to support South Vietnam in its fight against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese? So the North Vietnamese brought this war on us, according to Johnson, according to what he understands, with this Gulf of Tonkin incidents. So we're just going to go in and we're going to support the South Vietnamese government. Now, he's going to say, we're not going to attack North Vietnam. We don't want to escalate things. We're just going to help the South Vietnamese rid itself of communists, get the North Vietnamese out of there, and root out these insurgents within South Vietnam. Well, Congress will give Johnson the authorization to do that, and in 1965, Johnson will send 21,000 additional U.S. soldiers to Vietnam. So they're going to arrive, and they're going to start setting up bases in Vietnam. Okay, so U.S. soldiers start arriving here. The initial advisors, they were just in camps with the South Vietnamese army, but now we've got American soldiers. They're going to be setting up their own independent camps with the idea that we're going to support the South Vietnamese and pushing the North Vietnamese out and getting these Viet Cong out of here. Well, if you put soldiers in here, American soldiers into this area that's essentially a war zone, what's probably going to happen? Some of them are going to die, and that's basically what's going to happen. Is some soldiers in early 1965 will be attacked by the Viet Cong, and some American soldiers are going to be killed. Well, what do we do now? All right, you now have Americans that have been killed, so we got to send more soldiers to find those who killed these American soldiers. So Johnson will then send more soldiers there. Well, you send more soldiers into this area, you're going to get more soldiers killed. Well, what's their answer to that? Send more soldiers. So beginning with Johnson's administration, we see a couple more soldiers go in. This leads to more conflict. More conflict leads to more soldiers, which leads to more conflict, which leads to more soldiers, which leads to more conflict. And as we're going to be talking about, this 16,000 soldiers, or this 21,000 soldiers initially sent by Johnson, is eventually going to get up to 500,000 American soldiers. And that's going to be a slow buildup from the beginning of Johnson's administration to the middle of his administration. So what are these soldiers being sent to do? Well, again, their thing is you get in here, you find the Viet Cong, these guys who are attacking, these insurgents who are attacking South Vietnamese government targets in the countryside of South Vietnam. That might sound crazy. Vietnam is an incredibly jungle-filled country. A lot of it's at elevation. There's mountains, ravines, there's crags, there's it's just very rough country. So sending some people there to find people that aren't wearing uniforms that might be supporting the insurgency is going to sound difficult. And as we're going to see, it's going to prove difficult, but it's not that crazy on paper because South Vietnam's not a very big country. If you take this place right here, it's basically the distance from Fort Worth to Dallas. So you'd think if you throw 500,000 people in here, you're going to be able to investigate just about everybody, and you're going to be able to find, anybody who's got a gun, anybody who's supporting the insurgencies with enough people. So basically, we're going to throw Americans over there. They're going to search the countryside, and they're going to find villages, investigate them, see if they're harboring guns, any of these Viet Cong, and you're going to look to see if the North Vietnamese had placed bases here in the countryside or keeping soldiers here, providing arms to the Viet Cong or anything like that. So basically the main goal is going to be root out the Viet Cong. Now, as we're going to see, that kind of makes sense, but then if you go into a village and you say, do you have any guns here? Are you supporting the insurgents? Let's pretend they're not, but then you come in here, you rip up their floorboards to check for guns, you start kicking down crops to search for guns. You maybe suspect you do find one Viet Cong in a village, but the rest of the people, oh, that's just cousin Bill, nobody supports him. But then you assume the village is all Viet Cong, and you start, rounding people up. This village that had no interest in any of this stuff before, now these Americans coming in and they're kicking down doors. As soon as the Americans leave, maybe they do become Viet Cong. So what we're going to see is this is actually going to start increasing the numbers of Viet Cong instead of decreasing it. And again, what do we do about North Vietnam? Because they're not only supporting the Viet Cong by sending soldiers down here, or by sending arms down here, they actually have soldiers. They're sending armies into the countryside of South Vietnam. What do we do about them? Well, the orders are going to be, if you find them in South Vietnam, then you attack them. Well, what if a North Vietnamese army invades, attacks a South Vietnamese target, then runs to Cambodia? What are the U.S. soldiers supposed to do then? Do you go into Cambodia, but then you might escalate things? You're adding an additional country to the conflict. Why don't we just invade North Vietnam itself? Johnson will consider that, but again, he thinks if this happens, then you might be escalating things, because what had happened when the U.S. had invaded North Korea is China had entered and it turned into a much bigger war. The U.S. is afraid if we invade North Vietnam, China's going to get nervous, invade North Vietnam, and then we'll have a very different war on our hand. So the whole idea is don't go outside of the borders, but just search within here for Viet Cong and any North Vietnamese have taken up here. And then the other thing the United States is going to be doing is we're not going to invade North Vietnam, but we will bomb military targets in North Vietnam. So if they're it looks like they're about to deploy tanks to send to South Vietnam, and a lot of times, by the way, the North Vietnamese will go through Laos and Cambodia to get to South Vietnam. Then maybe we bomb them, bomb their tanks and planes, their industrial targets while they're in North Vietnam. So Johnson just starts sending people in to South Vietnam, and this is actually going to require increasing the size of the draft. So during World War II, or since right before the beginning of World War II, the United States had a draft. They had lifted all these restrictions or requirements for the draft to where just about anybody under a certain age that didn't, have exemptions went to the served for the United States in World War II. Well, they decreased the exemptions, or I guess as you say, they increased the exemptions post World War II, but they'd still maintain the draft. So a number of Americans coming out of high school had been drafted into the military. Well, they're going to start upping those numbers of drafted again, not to World War II numbers or anything, but you're going to start seeing these Americans start going to South Vietnam who were drafted, didn't volunteer for service. So Americans again coming in initially as advisors, but then start coming in to help the South Vietnamese rout out the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. This expands conflict, then you get even more Americans coming in. Well, numbers keep going up until 1968. And all while this is happening, Johnson's going to be telling the American public, this is fine, this isn't a big deal. We're almost done down here. We've almost cleared the countryside of the Viet Cong, and we've almost gotten the North Vietnamese out of here. It's only a matter of time before South Vietnamese is in the hands of a democratic, pro-Western capitalist government, and the communist threat to South Vietnam is taken over, is gone. So Johnson keeps making these promises to the American public, and the American public believes him until something's going to happen in February 1968 that will tell the American public, maybe this thing isn't as simple as Johnson's been promising us. Maybe it's not as simple as just tossing a couple 100,000 American soldiers in here. Maybe this thing's going to last a lot longer. What's going to happen is something known as the Tet Offensive. So, by the way, this would be a picture of American soldiers. They'd be going into a Vietnamese village. They'd try to find out who's supporting the Viet Cong, and then anybody that's supporting them. Again, how you find this out, sort of a lot of guesswork, but you find them, then you arrest them, and then you throw them in prison. And again, the U.S. is hoping you do this enough. Essentially, the Viet Cong threat will be gone in the South. So this is a situation in up until February 1968. I'm sorry, January and February 1968, when we're going to see something called this Tet Offensive. So in Vietnam, there's this holiday called Tet, where basically it's like the New Year time, where there's this celebration for, I think it's like 4 days a week, something like that, where it's basically the countryside gets shut down. It's everybody celebrates. It's a time of peace. Now, up to 1968, the Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, nobody had fought during Tet. It's, guys, let's take a break. It's like Christmas time, essentially. I mean, it's not a direct translation of Christmas time, but this is a time where nobody does any fighting, and there'd essentially been a ceasefire every single year up to January 1968. Well, that's going to be what the U.S. soldiers and the South Vietnamese soldiers will assume is going to happen in January, Tet in January 1968. And as a matter of fact, the U.S. is going to let a number of its soldiers on leave from its various bases. South Vietnamese soldiers are going to stand down, assuming we have a couple days of rest during this Tet period. And they're not going to be on the ready because, again, in previous years, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese hadn't done anything during Tet. Well, unfortunately for U.S. soldiers and South Vietnamese soldiers, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong had been planning to violate this ceasefire on Tet, and they planned to launch this massive attack. And what North Vietnam is going to do is it's going to send in, during Tet, a number of invasion, essentially this invasions from North Vietnam, and it's going to tell the Viet Cong to emerge from its hiding spots and take over the major cities in South Vietnam. So Americans and South Vietnamese are going to stand down assuming it's this peace, but at the same time, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong are planning this major operation. And when Tet hits, so January 29th is when Tet officially starts, North Vietnamese will launch these invasions again across the border. They'll also launch invasions from Laos and Cambodia, and they're going to start. North Vietnamese will start attacking American bases in the South Vietnamese countryside. Now, these attacks on American bases are going to be complete failures for the North Vietnamese. The Americans, much better equipped, even though the North Vietnamese, a lot of them have Chinese-made weapons, Soviet-made weapons. American soldiers just better trained, better weapons than them. And so when the North Vietnamese attack, they're not going to take over. I mean, there's some minor victories, and they take over some minor positions, but the Americans are going to quickly take their positions back, and they're going to inflict 5-to-1 casualties on the North Vietnamese that they inflict on the Americans. I've actually heard it even much higher than that. This seemingly invasion from North Vietnam will be a complete failure. They don't defeat the Americans in any incident, and essentially the Americans are going to wipe out every North Vietnamese army that comes down and attacks. Okay, so in that regard, this thing, Tet Offensive, is a failure. North Vietnam doesn't do anything. The Viet Cong, initially, it's going to look like their part's going to be a success. So you have these insurgents. They had been in the countryside. There had been some in the cities, but nobody knew who the Viet Cong were because a lot of it was sort of a secret organization. You kept it secret because you didn't want to be found out by the U.S. or the South Vietnamese. But what happens during this Tet Offensive is while the North Vietnamese are attacking, the Viet Cong are going to move on the major cities in South Vietnam, and they're just going to start attacking anything that's in support of the South Vietnamese government. So they'll start attacking police stations, they'll start attacking the houses of politicians, and they're going to drag a lot of these politicians out on the streets, start shooting them, start having firefights with the police. And for a brief time, these Viet Congs will essentially take over the major cities in South Vietnam. It looks like it's a victory for these the Viet Cong forces. Problem is, though, is that once the U.S. have defeated the North Vietnamese army, U.S. forces are going to get together with the remaining South Vietnamese forces, and they're going to move on the cities. And now they know exactly who the Viet Cong are because they had to reveal themselves for these attacks on the cities. So the U.S. and the South Vietnamese are then going to move into the cities, retake these positions, and then they're going to find out, hey, that was Steve and his Viet Cong forces that attacked the police station. So now they're going to go to Steve's house. They didn't know Steve was a member of the Viet Cong before this. Now they know he is. And what's going to happen to the Viet Cong is essentially South Vietnamese army and the U.S. Army will take the Viet Cong, arrest them. This is actually a photograph of a South Vietnamese officer taking a Viet Cong, somebody who supports the Viet Cong, and just shooting him, executing him on the streets. This is a American photographer that takes this. So the Viet Cong will actually, even though they're successful in taking over the cities, it blows their cover, and essentially they're going to almost die off after this because once you get one, you can maybe get them to give information on others, and this destabilizes them. And again, North Vietnam had spent a ton of money during this invasion, so militarily, this seems like a huge defeat for pro-communist forces in South Vietnam. North Vietnamese lose a chunk of their army, and the Viet Cong are essentially disabled after this attack. Well, while it's a military defeat, in the long run, it's going to end up being a major victory for the North Vietnamese and the pro-communist forces in South Vietnam, because what happens is that, some people are going to look at this like, we lost, but hey, we were able to pull one over on the U.S. military. Were not expecting this Tet Offensive at all. We got one over on them. Not only that, this is probably the bigger factor, is that Americans are going to be seeing what's happening in Vietnam on their television. They're going to be seeing images like this. They're going to be seeing these fights between U.S. soldiers and North Vietnamese. And they're going to look at Johnson and they're going to say, dude, you told us this thing was almost over. You said this was going to be no major issue, but here we are. This major operation took place, and again, South Vietnam essentially got taken over. Sure, it was for a short period of time, but we had this major operation, and American soldiers are going to lose their lives. And it looks like, at worst, even though this is a victory, this thing's going to take a long time. You promised us that it was just throw a couple soldiers over there, the thing will be done, but now it looks like we're going to be in there for the long haul. So the American public, who had been largely staying away from interest in Vietnam, is now going to start saying to Johnson, you lied to us. This isn't going to be over anytime soon. And this is going to turn public opinion against Johnson. This is going to incredibly hurt him. This is actually Johnson sitting here in the middle of his civil rights initiatives, his Great Society initiatives. Now the American public's going to say, forget that. We don't trust you anymore because you told this thing wasn't going to be a big deal. It is a big deal, and it looks like it's going to go on for a very long time. This actually disillusions Johnson. He gets attacked so much for this Tet Offensive that he's going to decide, I don't want to run for president for a third term. So he had taken over at the end of Kennedy's term. Hypothetically, he could run again in 68. So he won in 64, can run again in 68 because he only served year and a half of Kennedy's term. But he's going to say, I don't want to. In March 1968, so this is right after the Tet Offensive, Johnson gets before the American public. He calls a press conference and he says, I will not seek nor will I accept the Democratic nomination for president. You can pick somebody else, Democratic Party. I don't want to do it. Now, he's going to decide to step down because the American public has lost trust in him. Democratic Party in this 1968 presidential election, we're not going to talk much about it. They're going to pick this guy named Hubert Humphrey to replace Johnson. He doesn't have Johnson's cachet with the American people, although, again, Johnson's lost a lot of that because of the Tet Offensive. And he's not going to be giving the right message on what to do about Vietnam. So what you actually see right after this Tet Offensive is a lot of these protests start emerging against the Vietnam War. And these things had started before when the draft started increasing, the number of Americans drafted. They're only going to further increase with the Tet Offensive because it looks like to a lot of Americans that, especially young Americans that could be drafted, a lot of these baby boomers that don't want to go off to war, they are going to start saying, it looks like I'm in college right now. I understood that Johnson was saying we'd be out of this soon. By the time I'm out of college, this thing's over. Now they're looking around, and they're going to say, maybe this thing's still going to be going on. And they're going to start stepping up the protests. Johnson doesn't want to deal with it. And so the American public's going to start to look for somebody else. Well, Johnson's not going to run. Hubert Humphrey's going to be the Democratic Party nominee. Don't worry about him. Don't worry too much about this 1968 presidential election. Just know the Republican Party is going to see an opening. So what it looks like now is the Democratic Party has messed up on communism yet again. And they're going to point back to what happened with Truman, losing China and this fighting North Korea to a stalemate. And they're going to say, we can win this election if we pick somebody that's known to be hard on communism. And the Republican Party is going to find this guy who lost the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and they're going to basically pull him out of retirement, and they're going to say, the American public trusts you to be hard on communism. Will you run for us, Richard Nixon? Well, Richard Nixon will run for the Republican Party, and he's going to run on this platform of bringing an end to the Vietnam War. Now, when he's asked how he's going to bring an end to the Vietnam War, Nixon isn't going to give very many details. He's just going to basically say, my plan involves making South Vietnam fight most of the war, and then decreasing the American troop presence in Vietnam, which is going to make a lot of young people happy because they don't want to go off to war, and it's going to make the Americans say, okay, well, the South Vietnamese will be responsible for their own countries. But then people are going to ask specifics. Nixon's going to say it's a secret. It's a secret, but he's going to call his plan Vietnamization, and he calls it this because he's going to say the South Vietnamese will be the ones fighting the Viet Cong, and the North Vietnamese American soldiers will support them, but we're going to start pulling troops out of there. So Americans like the way that sounds. We're going to help South Vietnam. We're not going to let it fall to the communists, but we're not going to lose American lives anymore, and we're going to get out of there. I mean, the practicality of a plan like that's somewhat ridiculous, but if you tell Americans what they want to hear, less dead Americans, while at the same time not losing the communists, that's what they want to hear. And again, they're upset with the Democratic Party from what's happened with the Tet Offensive. So Richard Nixon is going to win the 1968 presidential election fairly easily. So again, Republicans are going to take a good chunk of the United States. And what we see is it's actually kind of interesting here. You still got all this shift around the United States. The South, they actually run their own segregationist candidate, a guy named George Wallace, and he'll actually win a number of electoral votes. But Richard Nixon's going to win popular vote, not substantially, but electoral vote, pretty big percentage. So Nixon's going to take office. What does Vietnamization mean? Well, what Nixon is going to do is he will take office, and he's going to start reducing the number of U.S. ground troops to sort of make a lot of these people happy, particularly the people that don't want to be drafted. He's going to reduce the number of people drafted by the United States. The U.S. will start going more towards this lottery system, where instead of if you meet certain requirements, you join the Army. Basically, if your draft number gets called up, you'll have to go to war. Again, he's hoping this will lower public pressure because he understands that if more people are protesting Vietnam, the less chance he has to do anything. So reduce the draft requirements. And he's going to start pouring additional financial aid into the South Vietnamese army. So, while American troops are leaving, the South Vietnamese army, we're going to start sending them additional guns, additional weapons, tanks, that type of thing. He's not going to be invading North Vietnam. He's not going to be nuclear bomb North Vietnam. Again, you don't want China or Russia to get involved here. But we're just going to try to make the South Vietnamese army as big as possible. So supports the South Vietnamese army. And here's the big thing that's going to be a part of his Vietnamization. Nixon is just going to start dropping so many bombs on North Vietnam. He's going to authorize this bombing campaign when he takes over the presidency in '69 that will just launch almost daily airstrikes over Vietnam. A lot of these things will it's actually going to be more bombs dropped over this small country, North Vietnam, that'll be dropped over all of Europe during World War II. Not only will he do that, he's going to start dropping napalm and other things to prevent North Vietnam from sending troops down here through Laos and Cambodia. Some of this defoliation to prevent these, what would you call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where they would bring supplies to pro-communist forces in South Vietnam. Nixon will start bombing that. Actually, he'll even authorize an invasion of Cambodia at one point to prevent the North Vietnamese from using it as a hub to get supplies to South Vietnam. While at the same time he's doing all this, he actually is going to be speaking with North Vietnam and trying to negotiate that with them. So we're bombing the heck out of these guys. We're sending aids to South Vietnam, and then we're also withdrawing our troops. And he keeps saying to North Vietnam, just promise not to support the pro-communist movement in South Vietnam. North Vietnam will be hesitant to do that, in part because they see the U.S. is backing down, and they see eventually if we keep pushing this, South Vietnam will fall to the communists. So Nixon continues to do this. Eventually, Nixon is going to determine this is essentially a losing cause. No matter how many bombs we drop, if we're not having the soldiers there, if the American public becomes increasingly disillusioned, which they had continued to do from the Tet Offensive, they've been continuing to call on even more troops to be pulled out, then South Vietnam isn't going to have a chance to resist the communists. So in January 1973, he is going to meet with North Vietnamese leaders, and he's going to say that if North Vietnam will promise a ceasefire, then what he's going to do, so don't attack South Vietnam anymore, don't send any soldiers into South Vietnam anymore. So if you have a ceasefire and you return all U.S. POWs, so pilots have been captured when planes were shot down over North Vietnam, that type of thing, the U.S. is going to pull all of its remaining troops out of South Vietnam. So what Nixon will sell this to the American people as is that, all right, we're just telling North Vietnam, promise you won't attack South Vietnam, and then we're going to leave South Vietnam to be protected by South Vietnamese troops. And he's going to be saying to the American public, South Vietnamese are qualified to do this. They're going to be fine after we leave. But in reality, what he's promising is essentially he's saying to North Vietnam, hey, you guys, just cool it for a little bit. We're going to take off once Americans are out of here. We don't care what you do with South Vietnam, because he realizes that he doesn't have the support from the U.S. public, and then he also realizes this has sort of become a quagmire. So he's basically saying, wait till we get out of here, and then you can take South Vietnam. So that's basically what's going to happen, is that North Vietnam will have a ceasefire, but then beginning in 1975, after the U.S. has pulled pretty much all of its troops and military advisors out of South Vietnam, North Vietnam will launch its invasion of South Vietnam, and these pro-communist forces will, already in South Vietnam, will rise up against the government, and the North Vietnamese will defeat South Vietnamese forces and take over South Vietnam, unifying it under this communist government. Now, if this were any other president besides Nixon agreeing to this ceasefire, if this were Johnson agreeing to the ceasefire, people would say, you commie bastard, you've given up to the commies. But it's Nixon, and Nixon, going all the way back to that Alger Hiss case, being vice president for Eisenhower, he's able to do this because, again, he's earned this reputation as this anti-communist. So, and a lot of Americans basically look at Nixon and say he kind of got handed a situation by Johnson that was untenable. However you want to say it, though, essentially with that ceasefire, the U.S. agrees that we're pulling out of Vietnam, and the Vietnam War is over. And when Nixon made that agreement, he knew South Vietnam couldn't stand up to North Vietnamese forces. So this Vietnam War, the United States lost something like 60,000 dead. I think it's 58,000 to be precise. North Vietnam lost in the millions. South Vietnam lost in the millions as well. A lot of people in South Vietnam are going to be upset because the U.S. abandoned them. You know, basically, hey, you guys were supposed to be fighting with us. You pulled out of here, and you left us, the North Vietnamese. And by the way, when the North Vietnamese get in here, anybody that supported the Western government, capitalist government, you know, they're going to be, a lot of them be executed, things like that. A lot of South Vietnamese will apply for exile in the United States. We have a big Vietnamese population in the United States of people that move to the U.S. after U.S. starts pulling its troops out, after the North Vietnamese take this over. Again, though, big thing maybe you should take from Vietnam, though, is this is incredibly divisive war. A lot of people say the U.S. from the beginning didn't operate it right. The U.S. should have never been in there. Other people say the U.S. should have been in there, but the American public, you know, it pressured the president to pull troops out when it could have been won if you threw more troops in there. I'm not 100% sure what the case is, but it is an incredibly unpopular war, and the U.S. is, no question about it, going to lose the war. So the thing is, though, you would think this would, again, tarnish Nixon's reputation. But again, as we mentioned, a lot of people are just going to look at it as he was handed a bad situation by Johnson. Whatever the case, I think that he also is going to escape blame for Vietnam, because Nixon's actually going to get a lot of other positive stuff done during his presidency, and a lot of this will sort of gloss over what's happening internationally. So Nixon is a Republican. Republicans had been pro-business since pretty much the beginning of this class, beginning of the party, really. So they've been very um, pro business. By this point, they had long given up their progressive branch of their party, and they were essentially small government. We help business out. We believe the growth of the United States in business, but other than that, the government should stay out of things. So military matters and helping business out, that should be our focus. And then they also have that, again, anti-communist branch for it. So you would think at home that Nixon wouldn't be doing very much, or he would be undoing a lot of Johnson's Great Society. So again, Johnson, almost his version of the New Deal, the national government's the solution to the problems for the average everyday American. So you think that Nixon would get in there, immediately get rid of the Job Corps, immediately get rid of, try to undo the Civil Rights Act, all that type of thing. But that's not the case. Nixon's actually would be considered very liberal for Republicans, because he's going to say some of these things make sense that Johnson's been doing, and he realizes the American public is behind a lot of what Johnson's doing. So Nixon doesn't get rid of a lot of Johnson's, or he gets rid of very little of what Johnson and the Democrats had done in the 1960s. And as a matter of fact, he's going to, in some ways, expand upon the sort of liberal big government reforms that Johnson had been putting through. For example, Nixon, he gives government funding to this public broadcasting service, PBS, because he thinks it's going to help provide education to the those who can't afford, who parents work, that type of thing. Give them Sesame Street so kids can learn to read and write. Poor kids that don't have parents that they can teach them to do that kind of stuff at home. Give them some television to at least give them some education. EPA, this is probably going to be the biggest of Nixon's domestic policies. He basically, in 1970, looks at the Clean Water Act that Johnson been put through, and he says, we need more of that. The United States has become increasingly polluted. Air quality's become worse and worse. We need a body to protect the environment, to regulate business and not allow them to pollute. That's almost an anti-business measure from a pro-business guy. But Nixon will call on Congress to pass this EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and make it a part of the executive branch. Congress does. Nixon signs that into law. So domestically, he continues some of the Great Society's reform. Now, he's not going to be as ardent about it as Johnson, but it's not the attitude you would expect from a small government, a guy with a party that's now espousing small government. Besides that, Nixon, he's also going to have a lot of international success during his first administration. So we talked about Kennedy starting to have more friendly relationship with the Soviet Union. Again, the United States and Soviet Union, including in Vietnam, are still engaging in proxy wars with the Soviet Union. But through these agreements that started with the Soviet Union post the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. had started making treaties with the Soviet Union to start, or stop testing as much, start talks about reducing nuclear arsenal. Nixon continues this. In 1972, the U.S. is going to start its first major arms limitation talk with the Soviet Union, this SALT I. Basically, they're going to say, we've got too many nuclear weapons. We can both destroy each other 10 times over. Let's just go ahead and cut this down a little bit. We don't want to blow up the world. Soviet Union, there's a Soviet leader named Brezhnev at the time. You don't need to worry about him, but he's going to be receptive to this, and Nixon's going to keep up these talks. Now, again, U.S. is still ideologically opposed to the Soviet Union, but it doesn't want to blow. They don't want to blow each other up. Nixon's actually going to make inroads with another communist nation, China. So China, as we mentioned, fallen to Mao Zedong's forces in 1949. And had been controlled by a communist government since 1949. The U.S. had supported Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan, and initially the nationalist pro-Western Chiang Kai-shek government in Taiwan had maintained China's seat on the Security Council, and Mao Zedong, who controlled mainland China, did not have the Security Council seat at the UN for China, and the U.S. was adamantly opposed to allowing communist China to have the seat. Well, The UN eventually is going to get to the point where I don't care what you think, U.S., Britain, France, it's very obvious who's in charge of China. It's Mao Zedong's communist government. And they're going to make a vote to fill China's seat, not with Chiang Kai-shek's government, but with Mao Zedong's communist government. Now, initially, the U.S. is going to be upset about it, but when Nixon gets into office, he's going to look at this as essentially an opportunity. And he looks at this as an opportunity because even though China had fallen to communists, it's not exactly the same form of communism the Soviet Union has. And as a matter of fact, Mao Zedong and those who precede him or succeed him are going to have a lot of disagreements with the Soviet Union. They're both communists, but they don't agree on everything. And Nixon determines, I'm going to take advantage of that. And so in 1973, he's going to decide, I need to recognize Mao Zedong as ruler of China. And he travels to China. He meets with these communist Chinese official, and he starts to become friendly isn't the right word. He normalizes relationships. That's the official term for it. But he basically starts this diplomatic relationship with communist China that had not been present since the communist takeover in 1949. And he's going to start this economic partnership with China that, as we're going to see, is going to continue to grow in the 1970s and 1980s. Somebody besides Nixon, somebody without Nixon's anti-communist reputation wouldn't be able to do this. But this is actually going to end up proving beneficial to the United States because in some instances, the Chinese will actually favor the United States over fellow communist nations. This isn't something we're going to talk about, but China has a border dispute with Vietnam in the late 1970s. China will be anti-Vietnam, going against the communist government. It actually is going to be on the same side as the United States in that conflict. And again, there's going to start this economic partnership that will last a long time. So we see Nixon start, again, internationally, keeping the peace with the Soviet Union, starting this, friendship's not the right word, but this more open relationship with China. So domestically and internationally, except for what happens in Vietnam, Nixon does very well. Well, in spite of all this, oh, and by the way, you're going to see that he does very well because when the 1972 presidential election comes up, the American public is going to overwhelmingly re-elect him. He wins a popular vote substantially, almost 23% of the popular vote Nixon takes, and again, almost all of the electoral vote, because Americans say it's okay at this point. You're in the process of losing Vietnam. But you've accomplished so much other stuff that we're going to sort of forgive you. As a matter of fact, the only really unpopular thing that had happened with Nixon is vice president. He had to resign because of tax evasion charges. But besides that, Nixon himself hadn't been caught up in any scandals, so the American public gives him a big thumbs up in 1972. Well, the American public is going to quickly grow disillusioned with Nixon during his second administration, and this is actually going to come as a result of something that happens during the 1972 presidential election. So while Nixon's on his way cruising to this substantial victory, he's going to play a part in this incident that's going to come to be known as Watergate. And the reason this incident is going to be called Watergate is because it's going to take place in this Watergate hotel complex. So Watergate is a hotel in Washington, D.C. It's this huge complex. It pictures all these buildings right here. It's not all hotel. A lot of us will go to hotels. They always have the conference room, and sometimes bigger hotels have office spaces where companies rent out the office and they do business out of it. So Watergate is a hotel, but it's also office buildings as well, or office spaces as well. Well, one of the office spaces in Watergate during the 1972 presidential election was being rented out by the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, they're running their campaign. This is where they're mailing out their pamphlets, donate to the Democratic Party, get out and vote, that type of thing, beat Nixon, that kind of stuff. Well, in June 1972, and this is just a little bit before the election, 5 men will break into the Democratic office at Watergate. So I don't know if this is exactly where it is. Let's imagine this is Democratic Party headquarters. This is where they're doing a lot of their campaigning out of. 5 people are going to break into this June 16th, 1972. And what these guys are going to do is they're going to start planting bugs, listening devices here. They're going to start photographing Democratic Party documents. They're going to start um, um, basically finding as much information about the Democratic Party campaign as they possibly can. Well, as the men are breaking into this DNC headquarters, they're going to station 2 men nearby, one named Gordon Liddy and one named Howard Hunt, to watch to make sure no security guards come up and find them while they're planting their bugs and taking their pictures, that type of thing. So basically, it's going to be revealed later. These are members of the Republican Party or people hired by the Republican Party to learn about the Democratic campaign, to undermine the Democratic campaign. This is political espionage, I think it would maybe the good way to put it. Well, Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, they're nearby. They're serving as watch guys. Well, they obviously don't do a very good job because the security guard is going to notice the break-in. He's going to then call the police. The police are going to arrest the men, including Liddy and Hunt, the nearby watchmen, and they are going to. The police are then going to search Liddy and Hunt's hotel room. While the police are investigating their hotel room, Liddy and Hunt's hotel room, it will be revealed that Hunt and Liddy had just cashed a substantial check from the Republican Party. This is pretty stupid on the Republican Party's part. First, you probably don't need to spy on the Democratic Party if it looks like you're on your way to a huge victory like this. I mean, it's dumb. You don't need to do espionage. But second, it's even dumber if you hire the people, you write a check directly from the Republican Party to these 2 guys, and then you have the 2 guys stay in the hotel when the break-in's taking place. And you have the guys have the check on them while the break-in's taking place. So you have this check from the Republican Party, and then in addition to that, one of the guys, I believe it's Hunt, he actually has an office. He's so high up in the Republican Party, he has an office in Nixon's White House. So you basically have 2 members of the Republican Party overseeing a break-in of the Democratic Party's headquarters, planting bugs, and they have the evidence on them that it's obvious that the Republican Party had paid them to do this. So it's apparent that the Republican Party is guilty in this Watergate break-in, but we don't know how far this went up. It could have just been some dude in the Republican Party. It could have just been Joe Schmo, Republican Party member. Guys, I got a great idea. I'll get these 2 dudes. We'll do this break-in. And it could have just been a handful of members of the Republican Party. There's no indication. We don't know for sure if Nixon had anything to do with it. At this point, there's no evidence he had anything to do with it. It could have just been an underling in the Republican Party that carried this out. So Nixon, after this break-in occurs, and it's just going to be a smidgen on the news page. Reports of break-in to DNC, people suspect Republican Party members. Nobody ties it to Nixon, and it doesn't hurt him when the election, obviously doesn't hurt him when the election comes up. It's not going to be a major issue. So this is Nixon's fine at this point. And again, he wins the presidency, but he's going to start to mess up shortly after that. Shortly after the Watergate break-in, the FBI will start investigating to see how far up in the Republican Party it goes. Because this America, by this point, is a democracy. And this is, if you're stealing the other party's secrets, this undermines the thing of democracy. The FBI is there to investigate interstate crimes and to investigate crimes against the nation. It's the domestic secret body, I guess, or investigatory body. So they start looking in to see how far up in the Republican Party this goes. Well, what Nixon will do is order the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, the international body, the one that's watching the Soviet Union. He tells the head of the CIA to go to the FBI and say, stop investigating this. This has to do with international affairs. It has to do with the Soviet Union. That's why it was carried out. So this is going to be a CIA matter. Stop investigating it, FBI. So Nixon tells the CIA to tell the FBI to stop investigating it. That's kind of obstruction of justice, especially because, as we're going to see, this has nothing to do with international affairs. So Nixon's telling one body to stop investigating it. He's also going to give a thumbs up to a plan to pay off the burglars. So the police are going to bring these guys to trial, throw them in jail. What Nixon's going to say is Republican Party members are going to come up to him, what do we do about this? Give these guys some money, tell them to shut their mouths. He approves that. So we don't know, we still today don't know for sure if he directly ordered the Watergate break-in or if he had even knowledge of it beforehand, but right after, he tries to obstruct justice by preventing the FBI from investigating it, and he tells, he authorizes a payout to these guys. Well, he may have gotten away with this, but the White House, since FDR had been president, has a secret recording device. FDR, he wanted the future historians to see how awesome he was and to see what decisions he was making, what he was thinking when he was making decisions. So he ordered a recorder to be placed in the White House. And so since FDR, there'd been this device that had been recording everything the president said in the White House. Everything. Like, so you make a decision there, you talk to somebody, it's being recorded. Well, Nixon, they have these tapes. The FBI learns about these tapes, and it's going to order Nixon to hand them over. We're doing this investigation. We want to see if you're any part of it, so hand them over. Nixon, as president, will say, well, wait a minute. I'm the president. I'm an executive. It's my privilege to keep my information private. I'm not going to hand these over to the FBI. Well, essentially, the FBI will sue Nixon in this weird criminal constitutional case. It will make its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's going to have to rule, does the sitting president have to submit to an FBI investigation? They will rule that Nixon does have to turn over these tapes. Well, if Nixon was smart, he would have had one of his aides go take those tapes, burn them in a fire, and then say, executive privilege, screw you guys. But instead, he gets somebody, and I think it's basically an intern, to go through and edit the tapes, all right? So he's going to give the tapes to the FBI. When the FBI plays them back, they're going to find this section's missing, this section's missing, this section's missing. So they find that he's edited the tapes to prevent probably himself from being found guilty, maybe to protect other members of the Republican Party, so obstructing justice in that regard. And the FBI is going to determine that he didn't actually do a good job editing, because he's going to be saying a lot of stuff on these tapes that is pretty messed up, including a lot of stuff talking about how dumb the American people are, a lot of stuff that indicates just how paranoid he is. And so a lot of this information is going to get out into the public. So now it looks like to the public you have a president that had just obstructed justice and then has just talked poorly about the American public, and who probably, and at least in the minds of the American people, has just undermined democracy by authorizing this break-in on these party rivals. Well, Congress will be set to determine whether or not this violates his code as president, and basically there's going to be talk about impeaching Nixon. So impeaching means bring him up on charges with the majority of the House, then 2/3 of the Senate would have to agree to remove him from office. And so before this can happen, Nixon realizes that he's definitely going to be impeached. Half the House will definitely vote to bring him up on charges, and there's a very good chance the Senate's going to remove him from office. So before this will happen, Nixon's going to decide, I'm going to resign from office, and he will step down as President of the United States. So this is going to do a couple things. Watergate, what do you think the American people think about this? They already didn't trust Democrats because of Johnson, and they felt, got them involved in Vietnam, didn't run things right. They're being dishonest about how much effort Vietnam would take. Now this Republican Party has straight up lied, undermined democracy, tried to cover up this Watergate incident. People don't feel they can trust the government. These guys are just out for themselves. Nixon will tell the average American that most politicians are dishonest, and this is just proof of it. Not only this is going to do demonize Nixon, it's going to demonize the Republican Party in general. Again, people that necessarily like the Democratic Party because of Johnson. Well, now the same distrust is going to be thrown in the Republican Party as well, and we're going to see a lot of people, hey, I'm not going to vote Republican because I don't trust these guys. So it's both parties are distrusted, but Republicans are going to be the ones that face the most distrust after Watergate. Well, another thing this is going to do is this is going to put in the presidency when Nixon resigns this guy right here. This guy's name is Gerald Ford. Thing about Gerald Ford is that he was never elected president or vice president. Now, we've talked about before, there's been plenty of vice presidents taking over for presidents. Johnson obviously took over for Kennedy. Teddy Roosevelt took over for McKinley. Before that, Johnson had taken over for Lincoln. Chester Arthur had taken over for James Garfield. Going all the way back, you had John Tyler taking over for William Henry Harrison. We'd had vice presidents taking over for presidents. Now, this is going to be the first time when a vice president is going to take over for a president who doesn't die. But the thing that's going to be unique is that Gerald Ford, unlike those previous vice presidents, he was not on the ticket when Nixon was elected in 1972. Basically, when Nixon was elected in 1972, his VP was a guy named Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was the guy who had been caught up on tax evasion charges, and he'd resigned from office. So what's supposed to happen if the vice president is removed from office while president's serving or something happens to him? Well, the president nominates a replacement and they're approved by Congress, and then that person approved by Congress will then take over the presidency. That had happened with Gerald Ford. So he took over the VP spot from a guy who had resigned from tax evasion. Now the president resigns because of this Watergate scandal, and this guy who had never been elected as president or vice president will take over. It makes kind of the democracy angle look a little bit silly. Fortunately for the American public, unlike Nixon or Spiro Agnew, Gerald Ford's incredibly honest. He's a really decent, intelligent guy. He grew up, where did he grow up? I think it was Nebraska. He actually had, at one point, he played linebacker from the University of Michigan. He was a tough dude. If you take him and Teddy Roosevelt, they'd have a pretty good cage fight. He was a amateur boxer, linebacker. He'd served in the Navy during World War II, entered the House of Representatives shortly after that. Served for a long time before Spiro Agnew is going to step down, and he's nominated by Nixon to replace him. Now, as we're going to talk about, we're not going to talk about Gerald Ford very much because he's not going to accomplish much because, again, he's the guy who was never elected president or vice president. A lot of people view him as illegitimate. And not only that, basically, he's not going to help matters because he's going to pardon Nixon almost immediately. Nixon hypothetically could have been brought up on obstruction of justice charges after he resigned, but Gerald Ford's going to say, nope, as president, I can pardon somebody, and he will do that. This is going to actually not only allow him or prevent him from doing anything good for the president during his presidency, but as we're going to see, it's almost going to prevent him from getting the Republican Party nomination in 1976 because a lot of Americans are going to look at him as dishonest, even though for the most part he was a very honest guy. All right, so we're going to talk about further disillusionment and Americans getting upset with the status quo next time.